Discipline. The word evokes images of willpower, control, rigidity. In popular view, being disciplined is synonymous with having a strong ego, capable of mastering impulses and imposing order on one's life. For this reason, indiscipline is seen as a weakness of character, a moral flaw. But this is a simplistic and superficial view of the workings of the human psyche. When one observes people's actual behavior more closely, it becomes evident that this explanation does not hold. Why do so many fail to maintain discipline, even with motivation and clear goals? Why do healthy habits fade after weeks or months of effort? Why do goals that initially seemed important become burdensome and unbearable over time? The answer to these questions lies not only in willpower, but in the hidden structures of the psyche. Depth psychology shows that human beings are not governed solely by their consciousness. There exists a vast unconscious that houses desires, memories, fears, and archetypes which operate independently of conscious intention. The ego, the conscious part of the psyche, does not control the entirety of the being. On the contrary, it often ignores or represses unconscious content that, by remaining unrecognized, manifests autonomously. It is precisely here that the true root of indiscipline resides. It is not merely a lack of effort or laziness. It is an internal conflict, often invisible, between conscious will and the unconscious forces that follow their own logic. When these conflicts are not recognized and resolved, blockages, self-sabotage, and a constant feeling of fighting against oneself arise. Furthermore, modern culture imposes a model of success and productivity that reinforces the dissociation between the persona, the social mask that the individual presents to the world, and the true self. Many try to maintain an image of discipline and control to meet external expectations, but internally, they live disconnected from their own deep desires and needs. This misalignment generates tension and psychic fatigue, making discipline an artificial and unsustainable effort. Therefore, building true, solid, and lasting discipline requires more than organizational techniques and willpower. It demands deep psychological work, the integration of unconscious content, the confrontation of the shadow, the alignment between persona and self, and the harmonization of psychic energy. Only when there is this internal balance does discipline cease to be an imposed burden and begin to flow naturally. This video explores 7 psychological laws that help to understand the deep mechanisms that sustain or sabotage discipline. Based on the principles of analytical psychology, these laws reveal why so many fail in their attempts to discipline themselves and how it is possible, through inner work, to build an unbreakable discipline. It is common to imagine that, with enough willpower, any habit can be formed, any behavior can be maintained. This belief permeates self-help books, performance training, and motivational speeches. But from the perspective of analytical psychology, this approach is naive and doomed to failure, because the willpower of the ego does not operate in a vacuum. It interacts with the entire psychic system of the individual, and this system is profoundly shaped by unconscious contents that cannot be ignored or simply repressed. The unconscious is not a passive repository of forgotten memories. It is a dynamic field where autonomous forces, desires, complexes, archetypal images continue to act and influence behavior. Many of these forces, having been rejected, repressed, or never integrated into consciousness, end up manifesting in distorted ways, in impulses, in lapses, in symptoms, in invisible resistances that undermine conscious efforts. When a person tries to impose discipline without first having integrated these unconscious contents, they inevitably encounter internal sabotage. They feel a growing tension, an inexplicable fatigue, a sudden aversion to goals that once excited them. It is not that they do not want to be disciplined. It is that a part of them, an unconscious part, resists the command of the ego because it has not been heard, has not been understood, has not been integrated. Furthermore, the greater the repression of these forces, the greater the risk that they will express themselves in uncontrolled ways. The individual tries to force themselves to follow a rigid routine of study, work, or diet, but suddenly finds themselves overwhelmed by compulsions, procrastination, irritability, or even psychosomatic illnesses. These symptoms are not mere character flaws. They are signs of an unresolved conflict between the conscious and the unconscious. True discipline, therefore, is not built through imposition, but through integration. Before attempting to shape their behavior, the individual needs to explore their hidden motivations, understand the desires and fears that operate in the shadows of the psyche. It is necessary to recognize the rejected parts of oneself and work to integrate them into the conscious personality. Only then does the will of the ego cease to encounter resistance and begin to flow in harmony with the whole psyche. Without this integration, any attempt to impose discipline will result in cycles of effort and failure, of guilt and frustration. Psychic energy will remain divided, consumed by internal conflict, making each habit a battleground. But when unconscious forces are recognized and integrated, discipline ceases to be a constant effort. It becomes natural, sustained by an internal agreement among the various parts of the psyche. This is the first and most fundamental principle for building unbreakable discipline. But it is not the only one. There are even deeper forces that need to be understood, and one of the most powerful is the self-sabotage that arises from the rejected self. And that is what we will discuss in the next part. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Among all the phenomena that undermine discipline, self-sabotage is perhaps the most insidious. It is not an external enemy. It is not the environment, nor the lack of time or resources. It is an internal, silent movement that seems to arise from nowhere. An invisible boycott that prevents the individual from moving toward their goals. However, from the perspective of deep psychology, self-sabotage is neither random nor irrational. It is an expression of the rejected self. Each person carries within their psyche parts that have been repressed or denied throughout life. Desires deemed unacceptable, forbidden emotions, unresolved traumas, facets of personality that, because they do not fit social or familial expectations, have been relegated to the unconscious. These parts do not disappear. They continue to exist, charged with psychic energy, and seek ways to manifest. One of the most frequent forms is precisely the sabotage of discipline and personal progress. When the ego tries to construct an idealized identity, a self that is disciplined, productive, controlled, it often does so at the expense of these rejected parts. The result is an internal conflict. The rejected self does not accept being ignored. It acts as a compensatory force, bringing contrary impulses, creating distractions, generating self-destructive behaviors. Not out of malice, but as an unconscious attempt to regain psychic balance. Therefore, the more rigid the effort to discipline oneself without integrating these parts, the more intense self-sabotage tends to be. A typical example: a person decides to adopt an extreme productivity routine, denying their needs for rest, pleasure, or emotional expression. At first, they may even maintain discipline for a while. But gradually, resistances begin to emerge. Laziness, procrastination, compulsive distractions, irritability, loss of motivation. It is the rejected self-claiming space. And if this movement is ignored, it tends to intensify, completely sabotaging the disciplinary project. Thus, true and sustainable discipline can only be built from the reconciliation with the rejected self. This requires inner work of recognition and acceptance of these hidden parts. It is necessary to embrace the aspects of the psyche that have been denied, understand their origins, and give them a legitimate place in the psychic life. Only then can the energy that once fueled self-sabotage be redirected constructively. This is a delicate and profound process that cannot be resolved with superficial formulas, but it is absolutely necessary for those who desire a discipline that is not a constant battle against oneself. Because as long as the rejected self is not integrated, self-sabotage will continue to act, subtly, persistently, inevitably. But there is an even deeper step in this journey. Even after recognizing the rejected self, the individual needs to reach a level of psychic development where their discipline does not depend on constant effort, but arises from an authentic alignment with their true self. And that is what we will discuss in the next part. For analytical psychology, true discipline is not a product of blind effort or repression. An unbreakable will is not built simply by imposing rules and forcing behavior. The deep foundation of discipline lies in the process of individuation, the path through which the individual seeks to integrate all parts of their psyche and become what they are in essence. Individuation is not a concept of superficial self-improvement. It is not about becoming an ideal self or following an external model of success. It is an inner process of recognition, acceptance, and integration of all aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, persona and self. As the individual progresses on this path, their will ceases to be fragmented and begins to align with a deeper and more authentic psychic center. Most people live in a state of internal conflict. The ego wants one thing, the unconscious wants another. The persona demands a certain behavior, the self demands a deeper sense. This fragmentation drains psychic energy and makes discipline a battleground. That is why so many personal projects fail, not due to a lack of desire, but due to a lack of internal coherence. When the individual advances in individuation, this situation changes. By integrating repressed contents and dissolving false identifications with the persona, they begin to experience internal harmony. Their psychic energy, previously scattered in conflicts and resistances, starts to organize around a central axis, the self. The will becomes more fluid, more consistent. Discipline then no longer requires Herculean effort. It becomes a natural expression of a more integrated psychic being. Furthermore, individuation brings clarity of purpose. Often, indiscipline arises because the individual pursues goals that do not correspond to their true self, objectives imposed by society, family, or culture. This creates a disconnection between the superficial wanting of the ego and the deeper motivations of the psyche. The result is resistance, disinterest, fatigue. In the process of individuation, the individual learns to distinguish between authentic desires and external conditioning. Thus, they begin to invest their energy in projects that truly make sense to them, where discipline flows much more naturally. Therefore, real discipline is not an effort against oneself. It is the fruit of a more integrated, more coherent psyche, more aligned with its deep center, and this is only achieved through individuation. But even with this growing alignment, there is an aspect of the psyche that, if not faced, will continue to exert a powerful and hidden influence over behavior: the shadow. And as long as the shadow is not integrated, it will have the power to compromise even the most well-intentioned projects. This is precisely what we will discuss in the next part.